The gun pressed cold against her temple, and the man holding it had the kind of smile that meant he had already decided how this ended. "Tell me where the deed is, Brianna," Clyde Harmon said, his voice silk over gravel, his eyes flat and patient the way a snake's eyes are patient. "And I'll make it quick." Brianna Bellamy did not blink. She had learned a long time ago that blinking in front of men like Clyde was the same as bleeding in front of wolves. She stood with her back to the bar of the Silver Spur Saloon, her hands raised slightly at her sides, her breathing controlled though every nerve in her body was screaming. The saloon was empty. Clyde had seen to that. Just her and him, and his two men blocking the door, and the particular quality of afternoon light that turns everything gold and merciless. "I don't have a deed," she said. "You're lying." "I'm not." Clyde stepped closer, and the barrel of the revolver pressed harder. "Your father left it to you. Everybody in Ridge Rock County knows it. That land is worth more than you understand, girl, and I have spent 4 years waiting to get my hands on it properly. I'm done waiting." "Then shoot me," Brianna said, "and see how far that gets you." The door of the Silver Spur burst open so hard, it swung back and cracked against the wall like a gunshot. And Sheriff Nathaniel Yates walked through it like a man who had all the time in the world, except his hand was already resting on his holster, and his gray eyes had already catalogued everyone in the room in the first half-second. He looked at Clyde. He looked at the gun. He looked at Brianna last, and when his gaze met hers it was the steadiest thing she had ever seen in her life. "Harmon," he said, "put it down. This is private business, Sheriff. You've got a gun on a woman in my town." Nathaniel Yates took one step forward. "There is no private about that." "Walk away, Yates. You don't know what's at stake here. I know enough." Another step. His voice had dropped to something that was almost quiet, but it filled the room completely. "Put it down. Last time I'm saying it." Clyde's eyes moved. Something in them calculated, measured, and found the numbers coming out wrong. He lowered the gun. And Brianna Bellamy, who had not breathed properly in 4 minutes, drew the first clean breath she had taken since Clyde Harmon had walked into her life again, and reminded her that in this world, a woman alone was never truly safe. She looked at the sheriff. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes, and even then, even in that moment with her hands still slightly trembling, and Clyde being dragged out past her by the deputies who had come in behind Yates, she thought, "I don't know this man." And somehow, that felt like the most dangerous thing of all. 3 weeks earlier, Brianna Bellamy had arrived in the town of Coldwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a Wednesday in October of 1882 with 2 carpetbags, a horse named Luther who was getting on in years, and a rolled-up letter from a man she had never truly known. Her father, Harold Bellamy, had died in early September. She had received the news via telegram to the boarding house in Santa Fe, where she had been working as a seamstress for the better part of 2 years. The telegram had been brief in the way that terrible news always is. The letter that followed had been longer, written in her father's careful, cramped handwriting, and it had told her 3 things that changed everything she thought she understood about her life. First, Harold Bellamy had owned land. Not just any land, but a full 320 acres in Ridge Rock County, deeded to him in 1871 and never sold, never mortgaged, sitting in the high desert like a held breath. Second, he had left it entirely to her. And third, a man named Clyde Harmon had been trying to buy that land for years, and Harold Bellamy had said no every time, and the letter suggested, in the careful, oblique language of a man who was afraid to say things plainly even in private correspondence, that if Brianna was smart she would be careful. She had not fully understood what careful meant until she arrived in Coldwater Creek and saw the way people reacted when she said her name, the way a silence would fall, the way eyes would slide away, the way the woman at the general store had pressed her lips together and looked at the door before telling her where the land office was. The land office had confirmed the deed was hers. A small man named Ellers with ink-stained fingers and the guilty look of someone who had been pressured into things he was not proud of had confirmed it quickly and nervously, and then asked her twice if she had somewhere safe to stay. She had rented a room at Mrs. Carver's boarding house on the main street, the kind of place that was clean and respectable and smelled permanently of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Carver herself was a stout, practical woman in her 50s who had outlived 2 husbands and approached life with the calm of someone who had already survived the worst and found it survivable. It was Mrs. Carver who had first mentioned the sheriff. "Nathaniel Yates," she had said, pouring Brianna's coffee the first morning, her tone the matter-of-fact tone of a woman providing important information. "He's been sheriff going on 3 years, came from up around Colorado. Honest as the day is long, which in this town is saying something because most days are crooked as a dog's hind leg." She had set the coffee down. "You're Harold Bellamy's daughter. You're going to need to know where the honest men are." Brianna had wanted to say that she had never found honest men to be reliably useful. She had said thank you instead and drunk the coffee and gone about the business of trying to understand what she had inherited. The land itself she had ridden out to see on her second day. It sat 7 miles north of town, flat in places, and then suddenly not flat, breaking into red rock formations that rose out of the earth like the thoughts of something enormous and very old. There was a creek that ran through the eastern portion, reliable water in a country where water was everything. There was an old structure that had once been a house, 2 rooms and a leaning porch, and she had stood in the doorway of it for a long time looking at the mountains in the distance and feeling something she did not have a good word for. Not love exactly, not grief exactly, something in between. She had not known her father well. He and her mother had separated when Brianna was 7, and her mother had taken her to live with relatives in Missouri. And Harold Bellamy had become the kind of presence in her life that arrived twice a year with awkward gifts and too much heartiness, and left again before she knew how to talk to him. He had sent money reliably, she had to say that for him, and he had left her the land, which was more than most men in his position would have done. She had stood in that doorway for a long time, and then she had ridden back to town and started trying to figure out how to make something of what she had been given. She met Nathaniel Yates on her 4th day in Coldwater Creek. She had been at the land office again, asking Ellers about the process for filing improvements and what the tax situation was, and she had come out onto the boardwalk to find her horse, Luther, being examined with calm interest by a tall man in a brown coat with a star pinned to it. "He's about 20, the man said without looking up. He was running a hand along Luther's neck in the easy way of someone who understood horses. "That right?" "22, Brianna said, stepping off the last board of the steps. "He's earned his retirement, but he won't take it." The man looked up then, and she saw the gray eyes for the first time. Not old eyes, he wasn't old. She put him around 30, maybe 32, with the kind of face that had been tested by weather and time and had come out of it with character rather than damage. He was not conventionally handsome exactly, but he was the kind of man you kept looking at because there was something in his face that suggested there was more there than the surface showed. "Nathaniel Yates," he said. "Sheriff." "Brianna Bellamy," she said. "New arrival." Something moved across his face at the name, not the sliding away thing she had seen in others, more like a confirmation of something he had already known. "I know who you are," he said. I've been meaning to come introduce myself. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, scratching Luther behind one ear while the old horse leaned into it with shameless gratitude. "Because you've inherited something that other people want very badly," he said finally. "And I think it's my job to make sure that situation doesn't become a problem." "Has Clyde Harmon spoken to you?" He looked at her steadily. "He came to my office 2 days before you arrived, said he had a business interest in the Bellamy land and he hoped there wouldn't be any complications." "And what did you say?" "I said the law in this county applies equally to everyone and that any business conducted in Coldwater Creek would be conducted legally or not at all." He paused. "He didn't like that." "No," she said. "I imagine he didn't." She gathered Luther's reins, preparing to go. He said nothing else, just watched her with those steady gray eyes, and she was already 3 steps away when she stopped herself and turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for the warning." "It wasn't a warning," he said. "It was an introduction." He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Bellamy." She rode back to Mrs. Carver's with the strange feeling that the world had shifted very slightly on its axis, and she wasn't entirely sure whether that was good or bad. She found out about Clyde Harmon's true intentions in stages, the way you find out about most things that are trying to kill you. First, from the land office clerk Ellers, who had finally gotten enough of his courage together to tell her that Harmon had been pressuring him to delay the processing of her deed, to find procedural problems that weren't there, to make things complicated enough that she might give up and sell. Second, from a rancher named Tate who ran cattle on land adjacent to her father's, a weather-beaten man in his 60s who had ridden out to meet her when he saw her on the land and told her plainly that Harmon wanted the water rights the creek represented, that there was a cattle operation he was building that needed that water, and that Harold Bellamy had been the only man standing between Harmon and owning half the county. And third, from Mrs. Carver, who had a way of knowing everything that happened in Coldwater Creek the way that certain women do, through the accumulation of small observations and the willingness to pay attention, who told her one evening over supper that Harmon had 2 men riding for him who were not ranch hands in any sense that word usually meant, men who had been seen watching the road north of town, the road to her land. She had gone to the sheriff's office after that. He had been there alone, the office a spare and orderly room with a desk and 2 cells in the back, a rack of rifles on the wall, and a wood stove doing its best against the October chill. He had looked up when she came in and then stood, which she had not expected. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I need to talk to you about Harmon." "Sit down," he said. She sat. He sat back down across the desk from her, and she told him everything she had learned. He listened the way he seemed to do most things, with complete and focused attention, not interrupting, not filling her pauses with reassurances or qualifications. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching Harmon for 2 years," he said. "The things he does are never quite illegal enough to make a clean case. He operates in the gray, pressures people into things instead of forcing them, uses legal mechanisms to get what extra-legal ones won't get him." He met her eyes. "He's dangerous, Miss Bellamy. I want you to understand that clearly. Not recklessly dangerous, but calculatedly so, which is worse." "I understand it clearly," she said. "What I need to know is whether the law will protect my deed." "The law will absolutely protect your deed," he said. "The deed is sound and recorded and legal. If Harmon tries to contest it, he'll find nothing to contest." He paused. "It's the spaces around the law I'm more concerned about. His men watching my road." "Yes. What do you suggest?" He looked at her for a moment. "I suggest you don't go out to the land alone. I suggest you let me know your movements. And I suggest you don't let Harmon get you somewhere private where the conversation can go the direction he wants it to go." She had thought. sitting there in the spare, orderly office with the wood stove clicking and the October wind finding the gaps in the walls. That she had been managing her own situation for a long time without anyone's suggestions, and had done reasonably well at it. She had also thought, with the particular honesty that she had cultivated as a necessary tool for surviving the world, that this situation was larger than she had managed before, and that refusing help on principle was not wisdom, it was pride. "All right," she said. He nodded. She stood to go, and then she turned because she couldn't quite let it lie. "Why?" she asked. He looked up. "Why the particular concern?" she said. "You said yourself you've been watching Harmon for 2 years. I've been here less than a week. Why should my situation matter more than anyone else's?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't brush it off or give her the easy answer. "Your father came to me 6 months ago," he said at last. "He was sick by then, though I didn't know how sick. He told me he was worried about what would happen to his land when he was gone. He told me he had a daughter and that the land was going to her, and that he was afraid Harmon would go after her the way he'd been going after him." He paused. "He asked me to look out for you." Brianna sat very still. "He described you," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone careful and quiet. "Said you were stubborn as a post and smarter than you'd ever let on, and that you'd probably tell me you didn't need any help the minute I offered it." She looked at the desk surface between them. There was a feeling in her chest that she had no name for, sharp and warm at the same time, the feeling of grief and something else intersecting. "He knew me better than I thought," she said. "He loved you better than he knew how to show," Nathaniel said. "That seemed clear to me." She stood up. She needed to leave before whatever was happening behind her eyes became visible. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, and made it to the door, and out into the cold October air where she stood for a moment with her eyes closed, and her father's description of her ringing in her ears. Stubborn as a post and smarter than she'd let on. He had known her. She had not known it until this moment, standing in the cold outside a sheriff's office in New Mexico territory, that she had needed to know it. The next 2 weeks were not simple. Nothing about Brianna Bellamy's life had ever been simple, and the situation in Coldwater Creek did not intend to break that tradition. She went out to the land 3 more times during those 2 weeks, always in daylight, always letting Mrs. Carver know where she was going. She was trying to understand what she had inherited well enough to make a decision about it. The decision was not obvious. She could sell, though not to Harmon. The thought made something in her stomach clench. She could try to work the land herself, though what that meant for a woman alone in 1882 in New Mexico territory was a complicated question. She could lease it. She could find a partner. Each time she rode out, she was aware of being watched. She did not see anyone directly, but she had grown up with the particular awareness of women who understand that being watched is a condition of existing in certain places, and she knew when it was happening. On the second visit, she found the creek deliberately fouled. A dead animal upstream, placed there recently. A message, not subtle, from someone who wanted her to understand that the land she thought she owned could be made difficult. She had ridden directly back to town and gone to the sheriff's office. Nathaniel had listened. He had asked exactly 2 questions, both specific and practical. Then he had stood, put on his coat and ridden out with her to see it himself. And the look on his face when he saw it was not angry exactly, but there was something very decided in it, something that said this had crossed a line. He had dealt with the immediate problem with the calm efficiency that she was beginning to understand was simply how he did things. And then he had ridden back alongside her, and they had talked, and that had been the first time they had talked as something other than sheriff and concerned citizen. She did not remember now exactly how it had shifted. Something about the quality of the afternoon light and the particular silence of the desert, and the way Luther and his horse kept pace without any guidance, as if the horses too were comfortable with each other's company. She had found herself telling him about Santa Fe, about the 2 years of seamstress work, the particular monotony and skill of it, the ways she had been good at it, and the ways it had made her feel invisible. About the boarding house there, which had been not unlike Mrs. Carver's but without Mrs. Carver's warmth. He had told her about Colorado. He had been a deputy up in a mining town near Durango for 4 years before coming south to take the sheriff position in Coldwater Creek. He said he had wanted a smaller place, somewhere that a person's efforts were still the determining factor in outcomes. He said the mining towns had disabused him of the idea that scale meant significance. She had looked at him sideways as he said that, because it was not the kind of thing she had expected him to say. "You sound like a man who has thought about this more than the job usually requires," she said. "The job usually requires thinking," he said. "About law, yes. About significance, that's less standard." He had been quiet for a moment, the horses walking, the red rock formations throwing long shadows east. "My mother was a teacher," he said. "She had certain ideas about what mattered. Some of them stuck." She had not asked more about his mother. There had been something in the way he said it that suggested it was not a simple subject. But she had filed it away, the way she filed things, in the part of her that was always paying attention even when she appeared not to be. They had reached the edge of town before either of them had noticed how far they had ridden or how much time had passed. She had said good night to him at the main road and felt, riding the remaining block to Mrs. Carver's, the particular unsettled feeling of someone who has enjoyed something more than they intended to. It got more complicated from there, because most things do. Harmon came to see her officially. She had known he would. He was that kind of man, the kind who believes that personal charm can accomplish what pressure alone won't. The kind who has never learned that some people genuinely cannot be charmed because they have seen through the mechanism too clearly. He came to Mrs. Carver's parlor on a Thursday morning, impeccably dressed for a man in cattle ranching, with a manner that was a careful performance of reasonableness. He was maybe 50, broad in the chest, handsome in a way that had clearly done good work for him over the years. He had the practiced ease of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of money and personality, and the thin line of something harder visible underneath when the performance shifted for a moment. Mrs. Carver had brought coffee and then very deliberately stayed in the adjoining room where she could hear everything. Harmon had made his offer. It was generous, she had to acknowledge that. More generous than the land's current assessed value, enough that a woman without prospects might find it very attractive. He had framed it in terms of practicality, the difficulties of a woman managing frontier land alone, the challenges of development, the wisdom of taking good money now rather than gambling on an uncertain future. Brianna had listened to all of it. She was good at listening to things while thinking something entirely different. "No," she said when he finished. His face did not change. It was an impressive piece of control. "Miss Bellamy, I don't think you understand the full complexity of your situation." "I think I understand it quite clearly," she said. "My father didn't sell to you in 11 years of your asking. I'm not going to sell to you in 11 days. Something moved behind his eyes then, something that was not the charm at all, something colder and more fundamental. It was only there for a second and then it was covered again, but she had seen it and she filed it away too. "I hope you won't come to regret that decision," he said. "I hope so too," she said pleasantly. He left. Mrs. Carver came out of the adjoining room with the coffee pot and refilled both cups without a word, and then patted Brianna's hand once firmly. And that was that. She told Nathaniel about the visit that evening. She had begun stopping by the sheriff's office in the early evenings, which she told herself was practical and which she suspected was something else entirely, though she was not ready to examine that suspicion directly. He had listened to her account of Harmon's visit, and his expression had done the thing it sometimes did where his eyes went still, and the line of his jaw got definite. She had started noticing these things about his face, the particular vocabulary of it, the way emotion moved through it in ways that were controlled but not concealed. "He's not going to stop," Nathaniel said. "No," she agreed. "We need to think carefully about your safety." "I am thinking carefully about my safety. I have been thinking about it constantly since I arrived in this town." He looked at her. There was something in the look that had started appearing in the past week that hadn't been there in the first days, something that she did not know how to categorize except as a tension of a specific kind. "I know you have," he said. "You're careful and you're sensible and you're not going to make stupid mistakes out of stubbornness. I know that." He paused. "I'm still worried." "Why?" she said, and then felt immediately that this was becoming a reflex, asking him why, pushing at his reasons, and that the reflex was coming from the part of her that did not entirely trust good intentions, because good intentions had not always been what they appeared. He seemed to know what she was doing. He was perceptive. She had determined in the way that people are perceptive when they have had to be, when the stakes of missing things have been real. "Because you matter," he said simply, and then looked slightly away, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Because you have come here to build something and you deserve to be able to do that. And because Harmon is going to run out of patience before this is resolved legally and I need to be ahead of that." She was quiet for a moment. "You said I matter," she said. "Yes. You barely know me," she said. He looked back at her. The gray eyes were direct, and there was something in them that was neither evasion nor performance. "I know enough," he said. "I know how you handle pressure. I know how you listen. I know you rode out to your land alone the morning after you arrived even though you knew Harmon's men were watching, because you needed to see it for yourself. And I know you came back here and figured out what you needed to know before you asked anyone for anything. I know you stood up to a man who frightens people who have lived here their whole lives." He paused. "I know enough to stay." She held his gaze. Something was happening in her chest that she recognized distantly as the thing she had been trying not to let happen. That recognition should have made her more careful. Instead, it made her say the thing she had been thinking. "My mother said that a woman who lets herself rely on a man has handed him the mechanism of her own destruction," she said. She said it often. She said it from experience. "Your mother wasn't wrong," Nathaniel said quietly. "There are men that's true of." How does a person know the difference? He thought about this seriously, which she would later identify as the moment she knew without any remaining ambiguity that she was in serious trouble. He thought about it for a real moment, not performing modesty or rushing to reassurance, but actually considering the question. "I think you watch what a man does when he has nothing to gain," he said. "That's the only reliable measure I've ever found." She stood up and gathered her coat from the back of the chair. "I'm going to think about that," she said. "Take your time," he said. She did not take her time in the way she intended to. The situation did not allow for it. Because 4 days after that conversation in the sheriff's office, Clyde Harmon's patience ran out. She had been at the Silver Spur Saloon, which sounds like a strange place for a woman like Brianna Bellamy to be, except that the Silver Spur also served food in the early evenings, the cook there being considerably better than the alternatives, and Mrs. Carver had said frankly that her back was bothering her, and she had not been up to cooking. The saloon's front room was respectable enough at that hour, the hard drinking tending to come later, and the owner, a man named Quill, who had a complicated relationship with the concept of propriety but a straightforward relationship with paying customers, had been perfectly civil to her. She had been finishing her meal when Harmon walked in with his 2 men, and the other patrons had decided very suddenly that they needed to be somewhere else, which told her everything about the situation before Harmon said a word. He had sent his men to the door. He had come to her table. He had been polite for exactly 40 seconds, and then he had stopped being polite. She had stood, which had been the right instinct because it kept her from being cornered at the table, and back toward the bar, which had been less right because the bar was a wall. And then the gun had been at her temple, and he had asked about the deed, and she had told him she did not have it on her, which was true. The deed was at the land office, recorded and filed, which Harmon knew, and which meant the gun was not really about the deed. The gun was about fear. He wanted her afraid enough to agree to sell, to sign the papers he had ready. She could see the folded document in his jacket pocket. She had not been afraid. She had been something past fear that might have been a kind of clarity. She had thought, distinctly and with remarkable calm, that this was not going to end with her signing anything. And then the door had burst open, and Nathaniel Yates had walked in, and the clarity had become something else, something warmer and more complicated, because he had walked in looking like a man who had decided this was not ending the way Harmon wanted it to end, and that decision had been absolute in every line of him. In the aftermath, with Harmon and his men in the jail cells in the back of the sheriff's office, with 2 deputies standing watch and Nathaniel sitting across from her in the front room while she held the cup of coffee, Mrs. Carver had materialized from somewhere in that aftermath. She said the thing she had said before. "You barely know me." It came out differently than she intended. She had meant it as an observation, maybe even as a kindness, a way of saying that he had taken a risk for someone he had no reason to take risks for. But it came out smaller and more fragile than that, like something that mattered more than she had wanted it to. He looked at her across the desk. He was not behind it this time. He had come around to sit beside her, the first time he had done that, and the ordinary chairs were close together in the small room. "I know enough to stay," he said, just that. The same words from a few days before, but now they were not an argument, they were a statement of fact. The flat and certain tone of a man who has made a decision and is not looking for permission. She set the coffee cup down. Her hands were steadier than they had been an hour ago. "You're being there," she said. "How did you know?" "Quill sent his boy to find me," he said. "The minute Harmon walked in." He paused. "I've told every business in this town that if Harmon does anything that looks like a threat toward you, they send for me immediately." She stared at him. "When did you do that?" "Week and a half ago." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to frighten you more than the situation already did." She was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. "That's either very considerate or very paternalistic," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought about it both ways. I still think I'd do it the same." She looked at him, this man who had walked through a door for her, who had made quiet arrangements on her behalf without making her feel managed or protected in the way that made her feel smaller, who had told her he knew enough to stay with the straightforward conviction of someone who meant it without drama. "My mother was right about most men," she said. "Probably," he said. "She wasn't right about all of them." He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and there was something in his face that was careful and certain at the same time, the face of a man who is very much hoping for something and is trying hard not to push toward it. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was a small gesture and a large one at the same time. His hand turned under hers and held on. "Thank you," she said. For staying. Always, he said, and it was the simplest promise she had ever been given, and she believed it entirely. Clyde Harmon was charged with 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon and 1 count of attempted coercion, which Ehlers from the land office, emboldened now that the gun was no longer the factor it had been, agreed to testify to. Harmon's 2 men were charged with accessory. The territorial judge rode circuit through Coldwater Creek in November, and the trials were straightforward. Harmon was convicted, sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe, and taken out of Coldwater Creek on a gray November morning in chains. Brianna watched him go from the boardwalk outside Mrs. Carver's. Nathaniel stood beside her. They did not touch, standing there, watching the wagon that carried Harmon down the main road and out of town, but the space between them was charged with something that had been building for weeks. When the wagon was gone, she said, "That's done." "That's done," he agreed. She turned to look at him. "What happens now?" He met her eyes. "What do you want to happen?" She thought about the land, 7 miles north, 320 acres of red rock and clear water, and the old house with the leaning porch. She thought about her father, who had described her to a stranger with love she hadn't known he had. She thought about the woman she had been in Santa Fe, invisible and capable and entirely alone. She thought about this man who had walked through a door for her and held her hand in the aftermath, and said always like it cost him nothing because it was simply true. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to work the land. I want to rebuild the house." She paused. "I want to see what this is," she said, and she looked at him directly when she said it because she was not a woman who said things to the middle distance. "What we are, if you want that too." "I want that," he said. "I have wanted that since you told me Luther had earned his retirement and wouldn't take it." He paused. I recognized something in that. She laughed, which surprised her. It was a real laugh, sudden and warm, and she saw something in his face open up in response to it, something that had been careful become easier. "Come to dinner," she said. "Mrs. Carver's, tomorrow evening." "Yes," he said. That was the beginning of the other thing, the thing that came after the danger and before the ordinary life, the thing that was neither of those but something specific to them and to the particular November in Coldwater Creek, when everything was shifting. He came to dinner at Mrs. Carver's on Friday evening, and Mrs. Carver made roast chicken, and was very carefully not delighted about it in a way that meant she was entirely delighted about it. She served them in the dining room, and then found reasons to be elsewhere. The conversation was easier than it had been before, without the weight of Harmon and the immediate threat, and also more complicated because, without that weight, there was room for other things. He told her about his family in Colorado. His mother had died when he was 19, a fever that came on fast and resolved the wrong way. His father had been a rancher, not unkind but not present in any real sense, a man for whom the work was everything and the people who did it were secondary. He had a sister, younger by 3 years, married now to a schoolteacher in Denver. He was close to her in the way that people who have been through things together are close, the way that closeness doesn't require proximity to persist. She told him about Missouri, about her mother's family who had been kind in the way that obligation makes people kind, a kindness with edges. About learning to sew because it was something she could be good at in a way that didn't require anyone else's permission. About the particular loneliness of being competent and invisible. About how she had learned to make those things coexist, even when they pulled against each other. He listened to all of it with the focused attention she had come to expect from him, and she watched his face understand what she was saying, not just the words but the weight behind them. "You've been making your own way for a long time," he said. "Since I was 17, she said. "When my mother died," he was quiet for a moment. "That's young," It was. She looked at the candle on the table between them, the steady flame of it. I got used to it, I'm good at it. She met his eyes. But I've been thinking about what you said. About watching a man when he has nothing to gain. And I've been watching you, she said. And I think you may be the most straightforwardly decent person I've encountered in a long time. She said it plainly, without qualification, because she believed it and because she had decided that this man deserved to be told clearly what she thought of him. That's not a common thing. He looked at her across the table in candlelight, and something in his expression was so honest and undefended in that moment that it made her chest ache. I think you're one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, he said. And I've been trying to think of a way to say that without it sounding like something less than what it is. It sounds like what it is, she said. He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. November moved through Coldwater Creek in the particular way of New Mexico autumn. The days still warm enough at noon, but the nights going cold and starry. The kind of cold that makes everything feel more precise, more real, like the world has had its edges sharpened. Brianna began work on the land in earnest. She hired 2 men from town, brothers named Cutler, older men who were reliable workers and who asked no complicated questions, to begin clearing the old house and assessing what could be repaired versus what needed to come down. She rode out most mornings, and 3 or 4 mornings a week Nathaniel rode with her. Not because she needed an escort anymore, Harmon was gone and his men scattered, but because they both wanted the time. The rides had become the thing she looked forward to most, the hour each way through the desert morning, the particular quality of conversation that happened on horseback in open country where there was nothing competing for attention. He knew the land and the region in ways she was still learning. He knew which plants meant water nearby, which rock formations were navigable in bad weather and which to avoid, the patterns of the seasons and what they meant for the creek and the grazing. He had been riding this country for 3 years, and he knew it the way you know a place when you've paid attention to it. She was good at the things he couldn't help with. The practical architecture of rebuilding, the calculations of cost and material and time. The management of the workers, which required a particular combination of firmness and respect that she had developed in the Santa Fe years. The decisions about what the land would be, the vision of it, which required imagination and practicality in equal measure. She was going to run cattle on half of it. The creek made that viable, and she had talked to Tate, the neighboring rancher, at length about the practical reality of small-scale cattle on that terrain. The other half she was thinking about differently, about what it would mean to have a real house there, what it would mean to not just work the land but live on it. She had not said that last part out loud to Nathaniel yet. It was too large a thing to say without being sure, and she was still in the process of becoming sure. In early December, something happened that had nothing to do with Harmon or the land or any of the external complications, something that was entirely internal and entirely about the two of them, and the particular chemistry of proximity and honesty over time. They had ridden out in the morning and come back in the early afternoon, and she had unsaddled Luther herself, as she always did, in the small stable behind Mrs. Carver's. He had helped her, which he sometimes did, the two of them moving around each other in the small space with the particular ease of people who have learned each other's physical rhythms without thinking about it. She had been reaching up to hang Luther's blanket on the high peg, and he had reached past her to take it because the peg was higher for him. A small and natural thing, except that in doing it he was for a moment very close. His arm passed her shoulder, and the warmth of him was immediate, and everything went still. He stepped back. She turned. They looked at each other in the dim, stable light, and whatever had been building since October was right there in the air between them, not ambiguous, not capable of being called something else. "Brianna," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way he usually said it, quieter and more certain at the same time. "Yes," she said, which answered the question he had not asked yet, but had been going to. He kissed her once quietly, with none of the tentativeness of people who are not sure of each other. She kissed him back with the same sureness. When they separated, both of them were very still for a moment. "I've been in love with you," he said, "since the morning you told me that Harmon had fouled your creek, and you looked like you were going to dismantle him personally with your bare hands." "That was only 3 weeks after I arrived," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's fast." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not sorry about it." She looked at him. The lantern light in the stable was dim and golden, and the smell of hay and horse was ordinary and warm around them. "I'm not sorry either," she said. They stood there in the stable for a while longer, just standing close together, her hand against his chest, his arm around her shoulders, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing, the way that particular combination of specific people can make the ordinary feel like something you have been looking for without knowing its name. Christmas came to Coldwater Creek, and with it, Nathaniel's sister, Clara, and her husband, Martin, who had made the trip from Denver because Nathaniel had written to Clara about Brianna in terms that had apparently alarmed and delighted Clara in equal measure. And Clara was not the kind of woman to receive alarming and delightful news from a distance. Brianna had been nervous about meeting them in a way she had not been nervous about anything in a long time. She had told Nathaniel this, which had required a certain deliberate overriding of the part of her that did not like admitting to being nervous. He had taken her hand and said, "Clara is going to love you. She loves anyone who is honest with her. And Martin is quiet and kind, and he loves Clara completely, which means he will like anyone Clara likes. What if she doesn't? She will. She had him. Clara Yates, who was Mrs. Clara Fowler by marriage and looked enough like her brother that the resemblance was immediately clear. Arrived on the stage from Santa Fe on the 23rd of December, and wrapped Brianna in a hug on the main street of Coldwater Creek, within approximately 45 seconds of introduction, which was not what Brianna had prepared herself for, and which immediately overrode her nervousness with something more like laughter. "Nathaniel has told me almost nothing useful about you in his letters," Clara said, holding Brianna at arm's length and examining her with frank and interested eyes. "Because Nathaniel writes letters the way he gives speeches, which is to say with great economy and no decoration whatsoever. But I can see that he has not exaggerated on the subject of your being formidable, and he did not have the sense to tell me you were also lovely, which I am cross with him about." "I'm standing right here," Nathaniel said. "I know," Clara said pleasantly. Martin Fowler shook Brianna's hand and said he was very pleased to meet her, and there was a warmth in it that was quiet and sincere, and she understood immediately what Nathaniel had meant about him. The Christmas holiday was 4 days of something that Brianna had not experienced in a very long time, possibly ever in the way it happened in those 4 days. The feeling of being included in something, of being part of a unit rather than adjacent to one. Clara and Martin and Nathaniel had their own history and their own rhythms, but they made room for her in them without making her feel like a guest, and she found herself moving into that space with more ease than she would have predicted on Christmas Eve, after dinner at Mrs. Carver's, which had been a generous and warm production involving more food than anyone needed and a great deal of conversation. She and Nathaniel walked home along the main street of Coldwater Creek under a sky that was entirely unreasonable with stars, the kind of sky that the desert makes in December, absolute and cold and dazzling. He took her hand as they walked, She leaned slightly against his arm. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. She had not had a Merry Christmas in years. The word had always felt like something slightly outside her reach, a warmth she could observe but not quite touch. Walking on this cold December street with this man's hand around hers, she felt it land differently. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the house. The house on the land." "Yes." She looked ahead along the dark street. "I've been thinking about what it's for, why I'm rebuilding it." She paused, because this was the large thing she had been circling for weeks, and she had decided that tonight she was going to say it. "I've been thinking about what it would mean to live there. Not just own it, not just work it. Live there." He was quiet beside her. "I've been thinking about what it would mean to live there with someone," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him, and they were standing in the middle of the quiet street under all those unreasonable stars, and she looked up at him. "Are you asking me something?" he said. "I think I'm telling you something," she said, "and seeing what you say." He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most, the one where everything careful about him dropped away entirely, and what was underneath was simply real, simply him, undisguised. "I would very much like to live there with you," he said. "I would very much like to marry you, Brianna, if that's what you're saying. If it's not yet what you're saying, I'll wait. But if it is, the answer is yes, without any qualification." "It's what I'm saying," she said. He kissed her there in the middle of the street in the cold December night, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and the stars went on being unreasonable above them. They told Clara and Martin at breakfast on Christmas morning, and Clara made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a shout and was entirely joyful. And Martin stood up and shook Nathaniel's hand with a warmth that said everything. And Mrs. Carver, who had overheard from the kitchen, came in and said she had known since October, and she was very pleased for them both, which made everyone laugh. The engagement was known all over Coldwater Creek by noon, because in a small town, warmth travels as fast as scandal and considerably farther. People stopped Brianna on the street to congratulate her in ways that told her she had been more accepted in this town than she had realized. That Coldwater Creek had decided she was there somewhere in the weeks she had been there, and the realization was unexpected and touching. They were married in March of 1883 in the small church on the edge of town, on a morning that was the particular bright blue of New Mexico spring, the air smelling of sage and something coming green. Clara and Martin came back from Denver. Tate came in from the neighboring ranch. Mrs. Carver was there in her best dress. Ellers from the land office was there, looking considerably less guilty than when Brianna had first met him, as though the events of the fall had resolved something for him internally. Quill from the Silver Spur was there, which Brianna found she appreciated in a specific way. She wore a dress she had made herself, deep blue, because she was a seamstress and she was not going to be married in anything she hadn't made with her hands. It was the best thing she had ever made. He wore his good coat and no star on his lapel, because this was not sheriff and resident. This was Nathaniel and Brianna, and he had understood that distinction without being told. The ceremony was plain and direct, and the words were real. When the minister said, "And do you take this man?" she looked at Nathaniel and said, "I do," with the particular firmness of a woman who has made a genuine decision and is not apologizing for it. When he said, "I do," it was the same, that flat and certain tone that she had first heard when he said, "I know enough to stay." The tone of a man who means what he says, because he has considered it carefully and found it to be true. They moved into the house on the land that spring, the house that the Cutler brothers had finished rebuilding over the winter, a proper house now with 3 rooms and a porch that did not lean, and she had stood in the doorway of it on the first morning the way she had stood in the doorway of the old ruined version 9 months before, but it was entirely different. She was not alone this time. He was behind her with a coffee cup and a look on his face that was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to go. "Well," she said, looking at the mountains and the creek and the 320 acres that were hers by birth and love and the full force of her own intention. "Well, well," he agreed and handed her the coffee. The first year on the land was hard in the ways that first years on land are always hard, relentless and physical, and full of small catastrophes and larger ones, and the occasional perfect day that made all of the catastrophes retrospectively worthwhile. They built the herd slowly, buying carefully, the small cattle operation that Tate had advised on, and that was beginning to show its first real returns by fall. Nathaniel kept his position as sheriff, riding the 7 miles to town each morning and back each evening, which was not ideal but was manageable and which would not be permanent. She worked the land during the days, which was not seamstress work and not invisible, and she was learning it with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She made mistakes and corrected them. She asked for help when she needed it and gave credit for good advice because she had never been the kind of person who confused pride with strength. She wrote letters to Clara regularly, long ones, and received long ones back. The correspondence between them had the ease of women who have decided they are friends on the basis of genuine recognition rather than proximity or obligation. She was happy. This required saying plainly because she had not been exactly happy in a long time, and the experience of it was both familiar and new at the same time, as if she had always known the shape of happiness and was only now inhabiting it fully. She was happy in the specific, daily, sometimes tired way of a person building something real. She was happy when she and Nathaniel sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the light go off the mountains. She was happy when they argued about the best approach to the western pasture fence, and both turned out to be partly right. She was happy when he came home from town some evenings with small things, not gifts exactly, but attentions, a piece of news she'd want to hear, a letter from Clara, once a book of poetry he'd found in the back of the general store that he thought she might like, and that she did. She was happy in the large and quiet way that she had not known was available to her when she had arrived in Coldwater Creek on a Wednesday in October with 2 carpetbags and an aging horse and a letter from a dead man telling her to be careful. She had been careful. She had also been brave. Those things together, plus this man, had made something she had not known how to want. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was going to have a child. She had suspected for 3 weeks before she was certain. And when she was certain, she sat with it for a day on her own before she told Nathaniel, which was not because she doubted sharing it with him, but because she needed to understand what she felt about it first. What she felt about it was large and complicated and fundamentally glad. Glad in a way that had some fear in it, because she was practical and she knew that children were not simple and the world was not simple, but the fear was inside the gladness, contained by it, not the other way around. She told him at dinner. She simply said it directly, the way she said most important things. He went very still, and then something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. Something that was entirely unguarded and entirely large, a joy so clean and complete that it had no room for anything performative. He came around the table and he held her, standing in the kitchen of the house on her father's land, and she put her arms around him and felt his breath against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "Are you frightened?" he said finally. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and I have never been so happy in my life." "That's the right answer," she said. He laughed, low and warm, and she laughed too. And the kitchen was warm, and the evening was coming down outside, and the mountains were going purple in the distance. And this was the life she had built with her own hands and his, and it was entirely, completely, unreasonably hers. She wrote to Clara the next morning, and Clara's letter back arrived 11 days later, and was 3 pages of joy. The pregnancy was not easy in some of its particulars, the early months especially, when she was sick in the mornings with a thoroughness that she found deeply irritating, as she was not a woman who liked being impeded by her own body. Nathaniel, who was patient in the ordinary way and extraordinarily patient in the ways that mattered, had taken over the morning coffee making without discussion, because the smell of it made the sickness worse, and had taken to doing a number of small things before she was up that she would otherwise have done herself, not in a way that was managing or overprotective, but in the quiet, practical way of someone who notices what is needed and provides it without making it a performance. She had told him once, in the middle of a particularly bad morning in July, that she was sorry to be such a difficulty, and he had looked at her with genuine puzzlement and said that she was not a difficulty. She was growing a person, which was considerably more demanding work than she was giving herself credit for. She had cried at that, which had surprised both of them, and he had sat beside her and not said anything, which was exactly right. The baby came in January of 1885, in the depths of the New Mexico winter, attended by the doctor from Coldwater Creek, a capable woman named Dr. Frances Hollis, who had come to the territory 2 years before, and who Brianna had specifically chosen because she would not feel managed by her. The labor was long and hard and genuine, the kind of thing that teaches you something about your own limits, and then shows you that the limits are further than you knew. Nathaniel was there the whole time, which was not standard for the era, and which the doctor had regarded with a slightly raised eyebrow and then not commented on further, because Brianna had made clear this was not a negotiable point. The baby was a boy. He came into the world in the cold January morning with the particular stubborn vigor of a person who has decided to be here. And when Brianna held him for the first time, the feeling was beyond anything she had language for. It was a sensation that reset certain priorities and illuminated certain things that had previously been abstract. She looked up from the baby to Nathaniel, who was sitting beside the bed with an expression she had never seen on any human face before, something so completely unarmored and completely real that it undid her entirely. "Hello," she said to the baby, very quietly. "Hello," he said, apparently to both of them. They named him Harold for her father, which had been her suggestion and which Nathaniel had accepted without hesitation, saying that Harold Bellamy had started all of this by trusting the right person, which seemed worth honoring. Harold Nathaniel Yates arrived in January and changed everything in the way that new people always do, by being entirely specific and particular, and not like anything you had imagined or prepared for. He was loud and demanding, and had opinions from the beginning, the kind of infant who makes clear that he intends to be a presence in any room he occupies. Brianna found that she loved him in a way that was nothing like what she had expected, nothing like the abstract love she had felt during the pregnancy, but something much more immediate and ferocious. Nathaniel was a natural father in the particular sense that he did not try to perform fatherhood, but simply engaged with the child in front of him with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And Harold responded to this by developing a clear preference for his father at approximately 3 months of age that Brianna found both charming and slightly unjust. "He spent 9 months in my company and I did all the work," she told Nathaniel, watching Harold fall asleep on his father's chest with total contentment, and he chooses you. He knows I can't make him do anything, Nathaniel said. Children are very practical about that. She laughed. She laughed more in this life than she had in any previous configuration of her life, which was the fact she returned to most often when she was thinking about what had happened to her since October of 1882. Since she had arrived in Coldwater Creek with her bags and her horse and her father's complicated legacy, and found a man who walked through doors and meant what he said. The cattle operation grew in 1885 and 1886, carefully and with intention. They hired 2 permanent hands, a man named Santos who had been working cattle in the territory for 15 years and who was worth twice what they paid him, and a younger man named Peter who was learning and learning fast. The herd was not large, but it was healthy, and the land was productive in the way that land is productive when it is genuinely cared for. Nathaniel began the process of transitioning out of the sheriff position in 1886. He had hired a deputy, a solid young man named Will Carr, who was ready. The town had grown enough that the county was beginning to consider formalizing things differently. He would finish his term and not seek another, and then he would be on the land full-time, which was what they both wanted. He finished his term in the spring of 1887 and rode home from town for the last time as sheriff on a warm April afternoon, without the star on his coat because he had turned it in properly. And when he rode into the yard and dismounted, she was there on the porch and Harold was there beside her, 3 years old and running experiments on what his father would do if he ran at full speed toward the fence. "You're home," she said. "I'm home," he said. He came up the porch steps and kissed her and then reached down and swung Harold up onto his hip, and Harold shrieked with delight and grabbed his father's coat collar with both fists. She leaned against the porch post and looked at them both, this man and this child, and at the land behind them, and at the mountains that were the same mountains she had looked at from the doorway of the ruined house in October of 1882. And the feeling was so specifically good, so full and exact and earned, that she had to close her eyes for a moment just to contain it. In 1888, she discovered she was going to have a second child, which she received with less trepidation than the first, and with a particular variety of quiet happiness. This pregnancy was easier in its early months, which she appreciated, though the summer heat was formidable, and she became creative about where and when she chose to be active. Clara and Martin came for a visit that summer, which had become a yearly event, and Clara's 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, ran around the ranch with Harold in a chaotic and evidently deeply satisfying triangle. Clara sat on the porch with Brianna in the evenings, and they talked in the long way of women who are genuinely friends, covering everything and circling back and saying the true things without preamble. "Are you happy?" Clara asked one evening, not as small talk but as a real question. "Yes," Brianna said without needing to think about it. "Completely." Clara looked at her with the direct eyes that were so like her brother's. "I'm glad," she said. "I was afraid, when he wrote to me about you, that he might have finally found someone worth caring about and she might not let herself care back. Because he's very careful with people he loves, and I was afraid you'd mistake the carefulness for distance." Brianna considered this. "I think I might have," she said, "for about the first 3 weeks. And then Clyde Harmon put a gun to my head and Nathaniel walked through the door and I understood that carefulness is not distance. It's just the way some people love." She paused. "The steady kind." Clara reached over and put her hand briefly over Brianna's. "The steady kind is the best kind," she said. The second child arrived in November of 1888, another boy, whom they named Marcus after a friend of Nathaniel's from his Colorado years, a good man who had died before Nathaniel had come south. Marcus was a different creature from Harold in every imaginable way, quieter and more watchful, with his father's gray eyes and her stubborn jaw. And Harold took to him with a fiercely proprietary love that was both touching and occasionally dangerous, as Harold's enthusiasms tended to be. Brianna recovered from the second birth more quickly than the first, which she attributed to being on her own land in her own house, and knowing exactly where everything was. She sat on the porch in the mild November afternoons with Marcus and watched Harold and Nathaniel in the yard, watched the cattle on the far pasture, watched the light on the mountains, and felt the life she had built radiating out from this porch in every direction, substantial and real and rooted. She had arrived in Coldwater Creek with nothing but a deed and a dead man's love and the stubbornness that her father had apparently described to a stranger with accuracy and affection. She had built this from those materials, this land and this family and this life, built it with her own hands and his, and every part of it was genuinely hers. There were things that were not simple and had never become simple. The injustice of a world that had required her father to leave his love in a letter because he hadn't known how to give it in person. The injustice of a world in which a woman's claim to what was rightfully hers could be challenged by any man with money and a gun. The injustice of the territory itself. She thought of this sometimes, of the Apache and the Navajo and the Pueblo people who had been on this land before anyone's deed had existed, whose claims were older and had been erased by force in ways that no law had adequately addressed. She thought about this with the honesty she brought to hard things, knowing she was the beneficiary of systems that had cost others everything, knowing that awareness was not sufficient, but that it was the beginning of something, that the way she ran her land and dealt with her neighbors and raised her children could be part of a different way of being in this place. These were not small thoughts, and she did not pretend they were. She and Nathaniel talked about them, as they talked about everything, with the directness that had always been the currency of their relationship. The land continued to produce. Santos became a partner rather than an employee over time, as his expertise and investment warranted. Peter became his own man, eventually moving on to start something of his own, which they celebrated rather than mourned. Harold grew into a child who was loud and funny and relentlessly curious, who was going to be trouble in the very best ways when he was older, and who made both his parents laugh several times a day. Marcus grew into himself more slowly, but the self he grew into was substantial and clear, a child who watched before he acted and acted decisively when he did, who had a gift for stillness that people found either comforting or disconcerting depending on who they were. Not at an ending, that was not the right word, at a place. A place she had chosen and built and earned, where the ground was solid under her feet and the mountains were the same mountains and the creek was running clear, because she had made sure it would run clear. And the man coming up the path toward her was the man who had walked through a door when she needed it most, and said, "I know enough to stay," and then had the rare integrity to go on being exactly that. She stood up as they reached the porch. Marcus reached for her and she took him, and Harold launched into the continuation of the explanation that had apparently been ongoing, and Nathaniel came up the last step and stood beside her in the evening light with that quiet certainty in his face that had never changed, not since the first time she had seen it in the Silver Spur, when he had walked in and changed the ending of a story that had been going the wrong way. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at him, this man she had barely known once and now knew entirely, the steady kind. "About how I got here," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, carefully around Marcus, who was investigating the collar of her dress with great seriousness. "Anything good?" "Everything good," she said. The mountains caught the last of the sunlight and went gold and then amber, and then the deep rose purple of a New Mexico evening. And the creek ran in the distance, clear and reliable, and the house was warm behind them, and they stood there together in the cooling air, the four of them, and it was a life entire.